The snow had already begun to dust the desks by the time Alina Chase lit the last candle. For 3 weeks, she had taught through the creeping cold, the children huddled in coats, their breath hanging in the air between sums and spelling. The rancher who owned the land, a man named Silas Grant, had refused the repair. He said the school was a drain on the county. He said a woman with a college education had no business out here in the first place. What happened next would not appear in any school ledger. Because after she fell asleep at her desk one final exhausted night, Silas Grant and his men went to work in the dark. Alina Chase was 24 years old, and the Willow Creek School was her first post. She had come west with books and ideals, only to find a roof that leaked shamefully and a county board unwilling to pay for shingles. The children shivered. Their parents were miners and homesteaders with no means to fix it themselves. And Silas Grant, who owned more cattle and influence than any man in the territory, had voted the repair down. So why, on the coldest night of the year, was he standing on that roof with a hammer in his hand? The schoolhouse sat at the edge of Silas Grant's grazing land, a fact he reminded the county board of every meeting. He paid more in property taxes than any 3 homesteaders combined, and he saw the leaky roof as a symbol of wasted money. Alina had arrived in September, fresh from a normal school in Pennsylvania, with a trunk full of maps and a belief that education was the bedrock of civilization. The reality was a single room with a dirt floor, 12 students aged 5 to 14, and a pot-bellied stove that smoked. Her first meeting with Grant was at the October board meeting. She had prepared notes, citing the territorial education statutes. He listened, leaning back in his chair, a man of 40 with the weathered patience of someone who negotiated with weather and cattle prices. "Miss Chase," he had said, his voice quiet in the small room, "the statute says a building, it doesn't say a dry one." The other 2 board members, a storekeeper and the blacksmith, looked at their hands. The repair estimate was $70. The vote was 2-1 against. So November came with a wet, early snow. Alina moved her desk away from the worst drip. The children did the same. They learned multiplication tables to the percussion of water hitting tin pails. The Peterson boy, James, developed a cough that sounded like gravel. His mother, a widow who worked as a seamstress, kept him home for a week, then sent him back because he was falling behind. Alina saw the fever glaze in his eyes as he struggled with his reader. She took the issue back to the board in late November. This time, she brought young James with her. The boy's rattling breath filled the silence after she spoke. The storekeeper shifted uncomfortably. The blacksmith, a man named O'Leary, cleared his throat. "The boy does sound poorly, Silas." Grant's eyes moved from the boy to Alina. There was no anger in his face, just a flat, impenetrable calculation. "Medicine is a family concern," he said. "Not a board one. A drafty school didn't put that cough in his chest. Hard living did." The vote was the same, 2-1. As Alina led James out, her hand on his thin shoulder, she heard Grant's voice low to the blacksmith. "Sentiment doesn't fix roofs. Money does, and we haven't got it." But that wasn't precisely true. The following week, Alina saw the ledger. The storekeeper's wife, flustered and sympathetic, had left it open on the counter when fetching Alina's order of chalk and slate pencils. The county fund for infrastructure had a balance of $120. The $70 repair was not an impossibility. It was a choice. That discovery changed something in her. It wasn't just neglect. It was a directed refusal. She began asking different questions, not about board procedure but about Silas Grant. She learned from old Mr. Henderson at the post office that Grant hadn't always been against the school. He donated the land for it, back in 1872. Something had shifted 2 years ago. The answer came from an unexpected source, Anna, the 13-year-old daughter of the Swedish homesteaders. She stayed after class one afternoon to help clean the boards. "Pa says Mr. Grant's boy died," she said, her voice matter-of-fact as she scrubbed at chalk dust. "He was 'bout my age, took sick real fast. That was before you came." Alina felt the air go out of the room. She asked the blacksmith's wife the next day under the pretense of ordering a new hinge for the stove door. The woman confirmed it with a sad sigh. Young William, bright boy, loved his books. The fever took him in a week. Mrs. Grant, she never got over it, past the next winter. Silas, he just closed up shop after that, sold off his breeding stock east of here. The school, the woman trailed off, wiping her hands on her apron. I suppose it just reminds him. The pieces clicked into a devastating whole. The refusal wasn't about money. It was about a monument to pain. Every dollar spent on that roof was a dollar honoring an institution that had failed his son. Education wasn't civilization to him. It was a useless ornament that couldn't save a boy. December deepened the cold. A new leak opened up near the woodpile. Alina took to sleeping in the schoolhouse 3 nights a week, her small cot wedged between the desks, because the walk to her boarding house in a storm was too dangerous. She would teach by day, and by night, she'd mend clothes for the children by lamplight, the wind howling through the gaps in the wall. Her own ideals felt like thin paper against that wind. On the 15th of December, the temperature dropped so fast the well pump froze. The children arrived with blue lips. Alina canceled lessons and spent the day having them run in place, sing loud songs, anything to generate warmth. She used her own meager salary to buy coffee from the store, brewing it on the stove to give them something hot to hold. As she handed a tin cup to little Macy O'Leary, she saw the girl's father standing outside the window, watching. His face was a mask of helpless fury. He didn't come in. That night, exhausted beyond thought, Alina fell asleep at her desk. Her head settled onto a primer, and the last thing she saw was the water, now frozen into a strange, rippled icicle, hanging from the new leak over the woodpile. She dreamed of a warm room and of a boy with a book who she somehow knew was William Grant. She did not hear the creak of wagons outside 2 hours before dawn. She did not hear the quiet commands, the shuffle of boots, the careful unloading of lumber and bundles of shingles. She did not see Silas Grant, his breath plumbing in the lantern light, staring at the crumbling roof with his foreman, a man named Joe. "The east side is worst," Joe whispered. "Joists are soft. We'll have to sister in new ones before we can sheet it." Grant nodded, his eyes moving to the window where the faint glow of Alina's single lamp still burned. "Do it quiet," he said. His voice held no particular tenderness. It was the tone of a man giving a necessary order about fence lines or irrigation. "She's dead on her feet in there. Let her sleep." And so, as the teacher slept, surrounded by the ghosts of her students' shivers, the man who had refused to fix the roof climbed a ladder and went to work. He pulled off the rotten shingles with bare hands, the splinters digging into his palms. He passed up the new lumber, hefting the heavy beams onto his shoulder as his men held the ladder steady. This was the contradiction playing out in the freezing dark. But here's the thing. Silas Grant wasn't alone on that roof. Joe the foreman was there, yes, but so was Tom O'Leary, the blacksmith who had voted against the repair. And the storekeeper, Mr. Higgins, was passing up bundles of shingles from the wagon, his breath puffing in the lantern light. They worked in a wordless rhythm, a conspiracy of silence against the cold. This was the real board meeting, held in the dark, with hammers and nails. O'Leary had brought his own tools. He set to work sistering the rotten joists, his massive arms driving screws into the new timber with a quiet, powerful efficiency. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward the window, a faint frown on his face. He had seen his daughter's blue lips that afternoon. The vote in the warm meeting room had been one thing. The sight of his child shivering was another. Grant worked beside him, stripping tar paper. His movements were precise, practiced. This was not the first roof he'd mended. He had built the original homestead cabin with his wife years ago. The memory of that time of building a future seemed to hang around him now like a ghost. He didn't speak of his son. He didn't need to. Every swing of the hammer, every careful alignment of a shingle was a language of its own. They had the east side stripped and resheathed before the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon. Higgins handed up a pot of hot pitch. Grant dipped a brush and began sealing the seams, the thick smell of tar cutting through the clean scent of cut pine. It was slow, meticulous work. The kind of work you do when you intend a thing to last. Inside, a leaner Chase stirred in her sleep. A dream of hammering, steady and reassuring, woven into her dream of the warm room. She shifted, her cheek cold against the wooden desk, and slept on. As the sky lightened from black to deep blue, the nature of the work changed. The men's movements became faster, more urgent. They were no longer repairing, they were covering their tracks. The new, clean shingles stood out starkly against the old, weathered ones. They had only brought enough for the worst section. The rest would have to wait, but the leak was gone. Grant drove the final nail, a smooth, solid tap that echoed in the quiet pre-dawn. He stood back on the steep pitch looking at their work. For a long moment, no one moved. Then O'Leary let out a long, slow breath. "She'll hold," he muttered. Grant nodded. He looked down at his hands, raw and splintered. Then he looked through the window again. Eleanor was still asleep, a dark shape in the gloom. "Let's go," he said, his voice low, "before the light catches us." They descended the ladders, loaded their tools into the wagons with the same quiet care. The evidence of their presence was everywhere: discarded rotten wood, piles of old shingles, footprints in the fresh dusting of snow. But they left it all, a mess for the morning to explain. The wagons rolled away, their wheels muffled by the snow, leaving the schoolhouse silent once more, save for the sound of a roof that no longer leaked. The sun broke the horizon, a sliver of gold. It was this light falling across her face that finally woke Eleanor. She blinked, stiff and cold, the primer stuck to her cheek. She sat up, confused. Something was different. The sound was gone. The persistent asterisk plink, plink, plink into the tin pail had stopped. She looked up. A shaft of sunlight speared through a hole in the roof, a hole that hadn't been there last night. It was a clean, new gap where the rotten shingles had been ripped away, but no water fell through it. Bewildered, she stood, her chair scraping loudly. She walked to the center of the room, looking up. The entire eastern side of the ceiling was wrong. The stains were there, but the broken, sagging line was gone, replaced by a straight, firm shadow. Her heart began to beat faster. She ran to the door, fumbling with the latch, and stumbled outside into the blinding white of a snow dawn. The cold hit her like a wall. She shielded her eyes and looked up at the roof. For a full 10 seconds, her mind refused to process what she was seeing. The new shingles, pale yellow against the dark gray of the old, formed a perfect, repaired rectangle over the worst section. Around the foundation, a scatter of discarded, rotten lumber and old shingles lay in the snow like a strange offering. Footprints, many of them, churned the snow into a muddy pattern. Someone had fixed it in the night while she slept. A wild, incredulous laugh bubbled up in her throat, only to die just as quickly. Who? The board had voted no. The parents had no money. She looked at the footprints leading to and from the road. Wagon tracks. This was organized. This was materials, labor, planning. Then she saw it. Half buried in the snow by the woodpile, a single tool, a hammer. Not just any hammer, a blacksmith's hammer, its handle worn smooth from a strong grip, its head distinctively squared. She knew that hammer. She had seen it hanging on the wall of Tom O'Leary's forge. The pieces, once again, rearranged themselves with a dizzying click. O'Leary had voted. Number O'Leary had been here last night, which meant the vote had never been the real story. The public refusal was a mask. The real decision had been made in the dark, with actions, not words. But why? Why the secrecy? Why let her and the children suffer through weeks of cold, only to fix it in secret now? The answer, when it came, was not from the roof, but from the road. The first child arrived for school. It was young James Peterson, still looking pale but walking under his own power. He stopped beside her, following her gaze up to the roof. His eyes widened. "Miss Chase," he whispered, "it's fixed." "It is," she said, her voice strange to her own ears. "Pa said it would never happen," James said, a slow smile breaking across his face. "He said Mr. Grant would see us freeze first." The name landed in the still morning air like a stone. Grant. Of course. The materials, the wagons, the organization. It could only be him. The man who had refused was the man who had repaired. The contradiction was so vast it felt like a physical rift in the world. The other children arrived in a cluster, their murmurs rising into shouts of amazement as they saw the roof. They pointed at the new wood, at the tracks, at the hammer in Alina's hand. Macy O'Leary ran straight to the tool. "That's my pa's," she announced proudly, as if he had left it there as a signature. The morning lessons were impossible. The children were buzzing, peering out the now dry window, spinning theories. The schoolhouse was warmer already, the cruel draft from the east wall gone. The change in the room was palpable, a lifting of a weight they had all carried for months. At noon, Tom O'Leary himself appeared at the door. He didn't come in. He stood on the threshold, his hat in his massive hands, looking at the floor. "Miss Chase," he said, "could I have a word?" She stepped outside, closing the door on the curious faces. She held out his hammer. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. He didn't look at the roof. "Thank you," Alina said quietly. "I don't understand, but thank you." O'Leary's jaw worked. He looked out over the snowy field toward the distant rise where the Grant Ranch house stood. "It weren't about you," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "And it weren't about the money." "I know about his son," Alina said. O'Leary glanced at her sharply, then nodded. Then you know the schoolhouse was a sore spot, a monument to a loss. Paying to fix it felt like approving of the thing that couldn't save William," he sighed. "But seeing the young ones, my Macy," he shook his head. "A man can hate a memory, Miss Chase, but it's harder to watch a child shiver because of it." "So the vote was for him," O'Leary said simply. "A public stance he felt he had to keep. The work in the dark that was for us, for the kids. And maybe," he added, almost too quietly to hear, "a little for himself too, to make peace with a ghost without having to say so out loud." He turned to go, then paused. "He won't admit to it, don't expect him to, and Higgins won't say a word. This," he gestured vaguely at the roof, the tracks, the silent agreement hanging in the air. "This stays in the dark, that's the bargain." He walked away, leaving Alina standing in the snow. The kindness, she realized, was entangled with a deep, stubborn pride. The repair was a gift, but it was a silent one, meant to absolve the giver of the need for gratitude or acknowledgement. It was the most fragile possible foundation for a changed reality. And it was about to shatter, because that afternoon, Silas Grant rode into town. He had business at the land office, and as he passed the schoolhouse at a distance, he saw the children playing outside in the weak sun, their coats unbuttoned. He saw the distinct patch of new shingles gleaming like a beacon. He had not intended it to be so visible. In the dark, he hadn't considered how the fresh pine would shout against the old gray. He also saw Calvin Thorne, the county clerk and a man with political ambitions, standing outside the post office, staring right at that same roof. Thorne was a small man with a tidy mustache and a nose for opportunity. He was also the one man on the county board who had been absent for the last vote, away visiting family. He was due back tomorrow. Grant's face, already stern, went utterly still. He knew what Thorne saw, not a repaired school but a broken protocol, an end run around the board's authority, a wealthy rancher using his own resources to alter public property after being formally denied. In the convoluted politics of a small territory, this wasn't charity. It was a challenge to the rule of law. It was, potentially, a scandal. Thorne tipped his hat, a slow, deliberate gesture. Grant gave a curt nod and rode on, but a new coldness had settled in his gut. The secret had lasted less than a day. The quiet act of reconciliation was now a public fact, and public facts had consequences. The next morning, Calvin Thorne took his seat at the board meeting. The usual business was conducted, road maintenance, a dispute over a stray herd. Then Thorne cleared his throat. "I have a matter of concern," he said, his voice smooth. "Regarding the Willow Creek School, I passed by yesterday and observed what appears to be significant, unauthorized structural modification. As the board has not approved any expenditure or work order, I must question the legality of this renovation." The storekeeper, Higgins, turned pale. O'Leary stared at the table, his fists clenched. Grant's expression was granite. "I believe," Thorne continued, letting the words hang, "the individual responsible for this unilateral action should be held accountable. And if county funds were not used, we must ascertain whether any private agreements undermine the board's authority to manage public infrastructure." He was looking directly at Silas Grant. The message was clear. Thorne didn't care about the roof. He cared about power. He saw a chance to embarrass the most influential man in the county, to paint him as a lawless aristocrat. The repaired schoolhouse was no longer a shelter. It was a weapon. And Alina Chase, sitting in her now warm classroom, had no idea that the piece bought in the dark was already unraveling in the light. The knock on her door came just as she was dismissing the children. It was Calvin Thorne with a polite, icy smile. "Miss Chase," he said, "I need to ask you some questions about the repair of this building, and about who you might be beholden to." The word beholden hung in the warm air of the schoolroom like a bad smell. Alina looked from Calvin Thorne's smug face to the children's confused ones, still gathering their things. "I'm not beholden to anyone, Mr. Thorne," she said, keeping her voice level. "The roof was repaired. The children are warm. That is all I know." "Oh, I doubt that's all you know," Thorne said, stepping inside without invitation. He surveyed the room, his eyes missing nothing: the dry floor where the pail had been, the satisfied faces of the children. "A structural modification of public property requires a permit, a vote of funds, oversight. What we have here is a clear case of a private citizen, likely one of considerable means, imposing his will upon county affairs." He turned back to her. "Who paid for the lumber, Miss Chase? Who provided the labor?" Alina's mind raced. O'Leary's warning echoed in her ears. He won't admit to it. This stays in the dark. To name Grant would betray the silent bargain and possibly get O'Leary and Higgins in trouble. To lie would make her complicit in Thorne's constructed narrative of corruption. "I was asleep," she said truthfully. "I heard nothing. I found the work done at dawn." "A convenient ignorance," Thorne sneered. He walked over to the window, looking out at the patch of new roof. "But property doesn't repair itself, and men don't work for free in the dead of night without a reason. I will find the reason." He left, but the damage was done. The children had heard every word. Young James Peterson looked up at her, his earlier joy gone. "Is Mr. Grant in trouble for fixing it, Miss Chase?" The question was a knife. It laid bare the terrible inversion Thorne was engineering. The act of kindness was being recast as a crime. By the time Alina reached her boarding house that evening, the story was already twisting through the town like smoke. Two versions were taking shape. In the homesteaders' kitchens, it was a secret blessing, a victory. In the land office and among Thorne's small circle, it was an affront to democratic process. The next day, Silas Grant did not appear in town, but his foreman, Joe, did. He found Alina after school, his face grim. "The boss wants to see you, at the ranch, tonight." It wasn't a request. The ride out to the Grant ranch in the fatting winter light felt like crossing into another country. The house was a long, low structure of solid timber, well kept but somber. Grant met her on the porch, not inviting her in. He looked older in the daylight, lines around his eyes etched deep. "Thorne is making a list," he said without preamble, "of every man who might have been involved. He's asking at the lumber yard in Clayton, 30 miles from here. Asking about large cash purchases in the last 2 weeks." Alina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he'll come to you again, and when he does, he'll have names. He'll ask you to confirm them, to say you saw O'Leary's hammer, to say you suspect Higgins provided the tar." Grant's gaze was unwavering. "He doesn't want to punish me. He can't. He wants to punish them. To show that crossing the board's authority, even in secret, has consequences. To make an example of the blacksmith and the storekeeper so no one else ever thinks to do the same." The ruthless political calculus of it took Alina's breath away. The repair wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a smaller, meaner war. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "Tell the truth," Grant said. It was the last thing she expected. "Tell him you saw O'Leary's hammer. Tell him you have your suspicions. But then ask him a question. Ask him if the health of the children is not a matter of county concern. Ask him why the board's authority matters more than a child's cough." He turned to look out over his land, his back to her. "I made a calculation in the dark. I thought a quiet fix would settle the matter. I was wrong. It's a public matter now, so it needs a public answer, just not the one Thorne is looking for." Alina rode back to town, Grant's words churning inside her. He wasn't asking for her silence. He was asking for her to step into the fight, to reframe it, to use her position not as a shield for him, but as a weapon for the children. But Thorne moved faster. The following morning, a printed notice appeared on the door of the post office. It announced a public inquiry into the unauthorized alteration of the Willow Creek schoolhouse, to be held in 3 days' time at the town hall. All parties with knowledge were encouraged to attend. The word "encouraged" was a threat. O'Leary's forge was silent that day. Higgins's store had a closed sign in the window by noon. Fear, the old, familiar glue of the board's authority, was reasserting itself. That afternoon, Alina did something she had never done before. She dismissed school early. She sent the children home with a simple instruction. "Tell your parents the teacher requests their presence at the schoolhouse tonight. It's important." As dusk fell, they came. Not all of them, but enough. The Petersons, the Swedish family, the O'Learys. Tom came, though he stood at the back, arms crossed. They filled the small room, their faces wary in the lamplight. Alina stood before them, no longer just their children's teacher, but a woman in the middle of a storm. "Mr. Thorne is holding an inquiry," she said. "He wants to find who fixed the roof, not to thank them, but to punish them, to make sure a thing like this never happens again." A low murmur went through the room. Macy O'Leary clung to her mother's skirt. "I won't lie under oath," Alina continued, "but I believe the question is wrong. The question shouldn't be who broke the rules. It should be why were the rules broken? And you all know the answer. Your children were cold. They were getting sick. James Peterson's cough is the answer. The answer is sitting right there." All eyes turned to James, who reddened but sat up straight. "The inquiry is in 3 days," she said. "If you believe this roof," she pointed upward, "and the warmth in this room is a good thing, then you need to be there. Not to defend a secret, to defend the reason for it." It was a gamble. She was asking quiet, weary people to stand up in public to invite scrutiny. For a moment the room was silent. Then Mrs. Peterson, the seamstress widow, spoke, her voice thin but clear. "James was feverish for a week. The doctor's visit cost me $4 I didn't have. I'll be there." One by one, others nodded. A quiet, determined solidarity began to replace the fear, but solidarity is fragile. The next day, Calvin Thorne played his ace. He didn't summon individuals. He posted a second notice. It stated that, due to the questionable legality of the modifications, the Willow Creek schoolhouse was hereby declared temporarily unsuitable for instruction until a full county inspection could be completed, effective immediately. The school was closed. The notice wasn't on the post office door. It was nailed to the schoolhouse door itself. Alina read it, her hand trembling with a fury so pure it felt clean. Thorne couldn't punish Grant directly, so he was punishing the children. He was making them pawns. The warmth, the dry desks, the victory, it was all rendered null by a piece of paper. The children arrived to find her pulling the notice down, tearing it into pieces. "Go home," she told them, her voice tight. "Tell your parents the school is closed, by order of the board." Little Macy O'Leary began to cry. It was this sound, more than any legal threat, that forged Alina's resolve into something hard and unbreakable. She saddled her horse and rode not to the boarding house, but to the newspaper office in Clayton, the county seat. The Clayton Courier was a weekly paper, run by an old journalist named Horace Bell who had a reputation for disliking petty tyrants. She told him the entire story, from the leaking roof to the night repair to Thorne's inquiry and the closure. She held nothing back. Bell listened, chewing on the end of his pencil. So Thorne is using a child's cough as political leverage, he mused, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. He shuttered a school to spite a rival, and the richest man in the county is the secret hero. He shook his head with a wry smile. Miss Chase, you have brought me a perfect little frontier drama. It has everything: pathos, conflict, a villain in a tidy mustache. Will you print it? She asked. Better, he said. I'll come to the inquiry, and I'll bring a photographer. 2 days later, the town hall was packed. Every homesteader from the Willow Creek district was there, filling the rough benches. Calvin Thorne sat at a table at the front, with the storekeeper Higgins and the blacksmith O'Leary seated stiffly beside him, not as colleagues but as persons of interest. Silas Grant sat alone in the front row, his hat on his knee, his expression unreadable. In the back, Horace Bell scribbled in a notebook, and a man with a bulky camera on a tripod stood ready. Thorne called the meeting to order. He spoke of procedure, of respect for institutions, of the dangerous precedent of vigilante charity. It was dry, legalistic, and utterly disconnected from the reality of the shivering children who filled the room. Then he called Tom O'Leary. Mr. O'Leary, is this your hammer? Thorne asked, holding up the very tool. O'Leary looked at it, then at Grant's back, then at the faces of his neighbors. It is, he said, his voice a low growl. Did you use it to perform unauthorized work on the schoolhouse roof on the night of December 17th? O'Leary's fists clenched. The room held its breath. He was trapped. To lie was perjury. To tell the truth was to betray the silent pact and invite retribution. But before he could speak, a clear, young voice cut through the tension. He fixed it. Everyone turned. It was James Peterson, standing on a bench, his mother trying vainly to pull him down. His face was flushed but fierce. He fixed it, and Mr. Grant fixed it, and Mr. Higgins helped, and my cough is better now. The dam broke. A chorus of voices rose from the benches. My Macy ain't been sick since. The room's warm. Since when is fixing a crime? Thorne pounded his gavel, his face mottled with anger. Order! This is an inquiry, not a town meeting. It was at that moment that Silas Grant stood up. He didn't turn to the crowd. He walked slowly to the front and faced Thorne. The room fell silent, the only sound the click of the camera's shutter. For the record, Grant said, his voice carrying easily in the hush, I organized the repair. I purchased the materials. I directed the work. Mr. O'Leary and Mr. Higgins participated at my request. He was claiming sole responsibility, shielding the others. The board denied the necessary funds. The children were suffering. I saw a problem I had the means to fix. I fixed it. Thorne leaned forward, a predator sensing victory. So you admit to willfully subverting the board's authority, to using your private wealth to override a public vote. Grant looked at him for a long, cold moment. Then he did something extraordinary. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. I admit to paying $70.40 for materials and labor. I am hereby donating that sum to the county school fund. He placed the paper on the table. And as the primary taxpayer in this district, and as a member of the school board, I move that we vote, here and now, to reopen the Willow Creek schoolhouse and to allocate those exact funds to complete the remaining repairs on the western side of the roof. The audacity of it stole the air from the room. He had just admitted to the crime, and then, in the same breath, used the board's own rules to legalize it retroactively and expand it. He had turned Thorne's inquiry into a board meeting. Thorne spluttered, You can't just. The chair recognizes the motion, said a weary voice. It was Higgins, the storekeeper, finding his spine at last. Do we have a second? I second it, said Tom O'Leary, rising to his feet, his eyes blazing. The vote was 3-1. Thorne was outmaneuvered in front of the entire town, his authority shattered. The school was reopened. The repair was sanctioned. It appeared to be a total, stunning victory. But as the crowd spilled out of the hall, buzzing with relief and triumph, Grant hung back. Alina approached him. That was, she struggled for the word. Necessary, he finished for her. He didn't look triumphant, he looked drained. Thorn is finished here, but the cost, he didn't elaborate. Horace Bell approached, notebook in hand. Mr. Grant, a statement for the courier, about your change of heart. Grant looked at the reporter, then at Alina, then out at the homesteaders celebrating in the street. No change of heart, he said quietly, so only they could hear. Just a late understanding. A schoolhouse is just a building. It's the children inside that are the monument. He walked away, leaving Bell to scribble furiously. Alina thought that was the end of it. The conflict was resolved. The school was safe. The hero had, in his own stoic way, emerged. But she was wrong. The true cost of that night's work was just beginning to come due. Because Silas Grant had not acted alone in the dark, and the other man on that roof had a price to pay that no board vote could ever cover. The price was waiting for Tom O'Leary at his forge the next morning. It wasn't a notice or a fine. It was silence. The big orders, the custom ironwork for the new hotel in Clayton, the contract for repairing the stagecoach company's fittings, were canceled. Word had come down from interests connected to Thorne's friends in the county seat. O'Leary had embarrassed the wrong people. In a territory where work was scarce, his public stand had made him a liability. He told Alina when she came to have a hinge repaired, his voice flat. They can't touch Grant, he's too big. They can't touch you without looking worse, so they touch me. It's how it works. Alina looked at the cold forge, at the man's soot-stained hands that had fixed the roof. How much? She asked. Enough, he said. He wouldn't give her a number, but the look in his eyes said it was critical. The blacksmith shop was his livelihood, his family's sole support. The secret kindness on the roof was now costing him in daylight. She left the forge with a cold knot in her stomach. The victory in the town hall felt hollow, poisoned. The community's warmth couldn't heat O'Leary's forge or feed his children. The repair had been a moral act, but the world it existed in operated on an economy of favors and retribution. She went to Silas Grant. She found him at the ranch, going over ledgers in a sparse office. He listened as she told him about O'Leary's canceled contracts. His expression didn't change, but the pen in his hand went still. I anticipated this, he said finally. Thorne's type doesn't fight fair. They apply pressure where the structure is weakest. Can you help him? Alina asked. Grant looked up from his ledgers, his eyes meeting hers. There was no sentiment in them, only calculation. If I give him work, it confirms their narrative, that he's my man, that the repair was a bought favor. It would only isolate him further from other clients. And if I give him money, he won't take it. He was right. Tom O'Leary's pride was as solid as the iron he worked. Charity would be an insult. So what then? Alina's voice edged with frustration. He stood up. He did the right thing, and he gets ruined for it. That's the lesson. No, Grant said, closing the ledger with a definitive thump. That's the problem, and problems require solutions. He stood up. Leave it with me. What happened next was not a grand gesture, but a series of precise, almost invisible maneuvers. Grant did not visit O'Leary. Instead, he rode to Clayton. He met with the owner of the stagecoach line, a man named Dobbs with whom he had done business for years. He didn't ask for a favor. He presented a proposal. The stagecoach line was expanding north. The new route would require way stations with sturdy, custom ironwork, hinges, brackets, hardware that could withstand hard use and weather. It was a substantial, multi-year contract. Dobbs was interested. You know a good smith? He asked. I know a proud one, Grant said. The best in the territory, but he won't take work as a charity. He'll need to bid on it fair and square. Dobbs agreed to put out the bid. Grant then rode to the homesteads along Willow Creek. He spoke to the Peterson widow, to the Swedish family, to the others. He didn't give orders. He made observations. Tom O'Leary fixed your children's school. The stage company is looking for ironwork. A man with a clear conscience does good work. The word spread. When the stagecoach bid was posted, Tom O'Leary was the only blacksmith in 3 counties who put in for it. His quote was fair. His reputation, bolstered by the quiet advocacy of his neighbors, was solid. He got the contract. The work was not a gift, it was earned. But the path to earning it had been cleared by the very man who had refused to fix the roof. The school term continued through the winter and into spring. The completed roof held firm. The county board, with Calvin Thorne's influence broken, quietly approved a small budget for proper desks and a new stove. The community, having found its collective voice, became more involved. Parents took turns providing wood, mending fences around the schoolyard, building a proper privy. Alina Chase watched the transformation. The schoolhouse was no longer just her post, it was the heart of the district. The children thrived. James Peterson's cough never returned. Macy O'Leary began to excel in arithmetic, her father boasting quietly to anyone who would listen. Silas Grant never visited the school, but one afternoon in early May, Alina saw him on the ridge overlooking the schoolyard, sitting on his horse motionless. He stayed for perhaps 10 minutes, then turned and rode away. She understood. He wasn't looking at the building. He was looking at the children playing in the sunshine where his son once might have played. It was his piece, made on his own terms. The story of the roof became local legend, told and retold, often with the secret night repair as its climax. But the true end of the story came on the last day of the school term. The children had prepared a small recital for their parents. The room was packed, buzzing with pride. As the festivities wound down, Tom O'Leary approached Alina. He held a wrapped package, long and narrow, in his hands. "For you, Miss Chase, from all of us." She unwrapped it. It was a new weather vane for the schoolhouse roof, forged from iron. It was not a simple arrow. It was a delicate, intricate design of a book open on a desk, with a quill pen crossed beside it. The workmanship was exquisite. "It's beautiful," she breathed. O'Leary allowed himself a small, rare smile. "Had to use up some scrap from the stagecoach job," he said, as if that explained it. He nodded toward the door. "We'll put it up directly if you like." And so, as the sun began to set, Tom O'Leary and Silas Grant found themselves on the schoolhouse roof once more. No secrecy this time. No darkness. The entire community watched from below as the 2 men, the rancher and the blacksmith, secured the new weather vane to the peak. It caught the last of the sun and gleamed. As Grant descended the ladder, his eyes met Alina's. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only acknowledgement he would ever offer. Then he mounted his horse and rode home. The school year was over. Alina packed her trunk, planning to visit family back east for the summer. On her last day in town, she stopped at the post office. There was a letter for her, addressed in a firm, unfamiliar hand. It contained no return address, only a bank draft for $100 made out to the Willow Creek School Book Fund, and a single line of writing. "For the next James Peterson, S.G." The final surprise was not in the money, but in the understanding it represented. He hadn't given it to her personally. He hadn't given it to the board. He had created a direct, untouchable conduit for the children's future, bypassing every bureaucracy and political maneuver that had started the whole affair. It was the repair, perfected. Alina Chase looked out at the schoolhouse, its new weather vane standing proud against the blue sky. The roof didn't leak. The children were warm. A community had found its strength, and a man had made peace with a ghost, not in the dark, but in the full light of day where it counted. She boarded the eastbound stage, the bank draft safe in her valise. Behind her, the Willow Creek School stood solid and dry, a monument not to loss, but to a quiet, stubborn, and ultimately redemptive act of kindness that rebuilt more than just a roof. The story of the Willow Creek Schoolhouse roof is a map of a different kind of frontier, not one of land claims and gold rushes, but of the human terrain between grief and grace, between pride and duty. It reminds us that the most enduring changes are often not announced with speeches, but arrived at in silence in the dark, with splinters in your hands. Silas Grant never became a public benefactor. He continued as a rancher, a man of few words, but the school remained dry, and the book fund he established quietly bought primers and atlases for years to come. Tom O'Leary's forge thrived on the strength of his earned reputation, and he never again hesitated to speak his mind at a county meeting. Eleanor Chase returned in the fall and taught at Willow Creek for 3 more years before moving on, having learned a deeper curriculum about community and resilience. And the roof itself, it lasted for decades. Long after the children of that winter grew up, they would point to it, telling their own children the story of the night the hammering didn't wake the teacher. The tale evolved as such stories do, but its core remained. An act of secret kindness that refused to stay secret, and in its exposure, healed more than it was ever meant to. We are drawn to these stories because they are compass points. In a world often governed by noise and transaction, they point to a quieter, more powerful north. The unspoken contract of community, the redemption found not in grand declarations, but in repaired joists and a warm room for a child. It asks us a simple, lingering question. What is the thing you have the power to fix, not for credit, but because it is right? And what would happen if you simply did it? If you found a map in this story, a compass point of your own, then do this channel a great service. Hit that subscribe button right now, because I am constantly searching for these lost tales of quiet humanity, and when I find them, I bring them straight here. Your subscription tells the algorithm that these are the stories worth telling. It helps me dig deeper, travel further, and bring back more. So subscribe, ring the bell, and join me as we uncover the next forgotten act of integrity, waiting in the shadows of history. I'll see you there.